Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffery, and I am here today with Paul Galloway. Paul has joined Strategic Treasurer as our newest senior advisor, so I'm welcoming him to the podcast and to Strategic Treasurer. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Craig.
Paul, maybe you could begin telling us just a little bit about your background so people know who's talking to them.
Yeah, I'm a Midwest boy, born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa. I did my undergrad at Iowa State, graduate degree at Iowa. I hold the CFA charter, and I have worked for a variety of companies within the Des Moines metro area. I've worked for a bank, an insurance company, a regulated utility, an ag business. I've consulted on my own. Most recently, spent 4.5 years in an insurance company, standing up a treasury function for the company, which didn't exist before I came there.
Excellent. So today's topic is security lending. I think this will be an interesting topic for anyone who's interested in treasury, though it may not apply to people in every industry. So maybe you could start off by, what is security lending or sec lending? What is that? And then maybe we can get into why this occurs.
Sure. Securities lending is what it sounds like. Companies have assets on their books and they have an opportunity to get additional yield on the securities by lending them to counterparties that have an interest in holding those assets. And they'll pay you a certain agreed upon rate for the use of those securities. And typically, they're used by broker-dealers and hedge funds.
Okay, so maybe give an example of several of the types of securities that, these types of assets that we would refer to as securities. What are some of these that would be lended?
Typically, it's bonds and equities. So you can do both fixed income instruments and marketable, tradable equity stock, or things that people would typically akin to the NASDAQ or traded or on the New York Stock Exchange.
You said that different types of firms like broker-dealers, et cetera, may need to have some of these assets. So why do they need to borrow them? Why don't they just hold them? What's the value and the rationale for doing this?
Yeah, they borrow them because hedge funds and broker-dealers will enter into positions where they'll be short a security and they need that as collateral for a transaction that they've engaged in. Some of these securities are not readily available in the market, so they can't go out and buy them. But they can go to insurance companies or other corporate firms that hold securities on the books and borrow them versus go out in the market and find them or buy them.
That's why the borrower would borrow those securities for collateral in that case that you're giving an example, whether it's a hedge fund or a broker-dealer. What's the reason for lending those beyond just the fact that there might be some margin? Because there's obviously some potential exposure that the collateral gets sold.
Yeah, there's typically two reasons. One is the lender of the securities is looking to enhance the yield or return on their portfolio. The other is that they want to take a certain level of risk, and they'll lend the securities and perhaps get bonds or cash or stock back and do something with them that could be riskier and try to get a return on that.
So from a lender or borrower perspective, what's the other exposure? If you're lending securities, what is your biggest concern? How is that mitigated with duration or with other techniques in the security lending arena?
So the biggest concern is, for me, in my past experience, has been reinvestment risk. Even though I'm lending the securities, I have to pay a benchmark rate back to the counterparty that has borrowed it. It's agreed upon upfront. It could be something like the overnight bank funding rate or something like that. And so that's the bogey that I'm trying to beat. So I take whatever the collateral is that comes back to me and I invest that in a way that beats that return. and I keep everything that's left, less the amount that I agreed upon with the intermediary or the bank who's the go-between myself and the counterparty. I get to keep everything else. Now, the other thing that can be risky in securities lending before 2008 and 2009, when things went, the Great Recession, securities lending was a lot more risky because the intermediary wasn't indemnified in the sense that if you couldn't get the security back, that was on you. So there was a big risk associated with not getting the security back. If the counterparty defaulted or went bankrupt, you couldn't get it back. Well, the way agreements are written today, there's an indemnification, which states that the intermediary is required to go out in the open market and buy the bond back and replace it, or buy a bond that is like what was lent, or a stock.
So this intermediary has to earn their keep.
They do. They got to earn their keep, right? They can't just sit back and just let it go. And they negotiate terms on your behalf. So they're looking to get the best deal because it's in their interest. They get a piece of the cut. So the better deals they negotiate, the more that goes into their own pocket.
I want to talk about the economics. I know there's going to be a lot of, it depends. It depends on a number of factors, the supply and demand for particular securities. Some securities are readily available and it's purely an economic transactions. Others are very hard to come by, and depending on how rare they are, that can have a influence. What might organizations be looking at in terms of a spread in normal markets or dynamic markets? What are some of the ranges that you've seen? This is not prescriptive or giving advice, but what's historically, where have you seen this move? Are we talking several basis points, 100 basis points? What's an investor who might consider securities lending, who holds these? What might they be looking at in different markets?
In normal markets, you could see spreads between 5, 10, maybe up to 20. It depends on what the target is. And it also depends on the security. For securities that are more readily available, or there's opportunity to get them in the open market, counterparty is going to be less willing to pay a premium. And so you may get close to flat or close to target and no better. And then for securities that you can't find out in the market easily, or they're not available, period, they're willing to pay much more for them because they are in a position that requires they have that particular piece of collateral and they don't have it. So they're willing to pay up to get it. And so that could be 50, 100 basis points in a normal market, maybe a little bit more depending on the security. Abnormal markets, such as when COVID hit, it could be hundreds of basis points to get the security on the books.
Any other risks that you see from the lender side before we move on to the borrower side?
There are tax consequences. You got to think about how things are booked on your balance sheet. So I think when you go into it, you need to look at the accounting aspects of securities lending. There are also regulatory things you have to consider. So you can't just look at the economics alone and the risks. You also need to look at the accounting and regulatory side of things.
On the borrower side, what are some of the risks that you see, maybe operationally or otherwise?
Yeah, on the borrower side, the lender can dictate how long they're going to lend the security out. You can lend securities out overnight and roll them. You can lend them over an agreed upon stated term, which could be weeks, months in duration. So the borrower could lose out if the lender decided that they didn't want to participate in the program anymore, or if they sold the security and needed the security back. There is that aspect that the borrower could have the security today and it could be gone tomorrow, which could put them in a tough position.
They don't have the collateral that's required for their other underlying financial transactions.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when we think about securities lending, who does this apply to? You talked about hedge funds and broker-dealers being borrowers of this, and there's others, obviously, but who are some other borrowers, and who does this make sense to enter this type of program? There's obviously a fair amount of setup to get a program running. Maybe you could talk to that.
Yeah, there is a little bit of a setup to get the program up and running. I mean, you have to enter into agreements with the intermediary bank. And so there are some legal requirements that have to be completed. You need to put together a stated or set parameters around how the program will operationally function. You'll have to work with your custodian who holds the assets. We set up, in the case of the program I set up at the insurance company I was with, I set up a separate custody account to move assets in and out as they were borrowed. You have to work with your investment accounting team and your investment operations team. You also need to put together investment guidelines. How is the collateral that's received from the counterparty going to be invested? There are a lot of factors that go into just setting up the program. And then you have to monitor the program. In the case of the program I had, I monitored the program every day. So I always knew what my positions were. I always knew what was going on with the investment team. And from time to time, we would have bonds that would be sold, and I'd have to get the bonds back. Or there could be involuntary calls on bonds, and you have to replace collateral. So there's challenges to managing the program. So you need to know how you're going to do that up front.
Let's say, just talking about a transaction, you have a security that someone wants to borrow. You pass that over. They need that for their collateral. And what are they giving you in return for that? In addition to a spread, what's their collateral for your collateral?
Yeah, so there's different ways you can run your program. You can receive cash. You can receive bonds. You can receive stock. You can receive any kind of security that you set up in the guidelines as acceptable collateral. In the case of the program we had, it was cash. It was treasuries. It was certain government agencies. And it really wasn't anything else. And for the most part, we ran a cash collateral only program because we took the funds and we did something with them that we felt that we could beat the benchmark rate and be able to earn a little bit of a return and keep it relatively safe.
Yeah, and then earn the spread on the or the fee on the collateral that you lended or the securities that you lended. Who else does this apply to? Who could consider participate in lending? Yeah, obviously, I have to have securities, but who would be typical players in this?
Typical players could be insurance companies are quite often typical players, but foundations, endowment funds, any institution that has securities sitting in a custody account. Let's just keep it that simple. If you have securities sitting in a custody account, you can lend those securities out. And so in reality, it can be agnostic to what type of entity you are.
Would there be a guideline to say you need to have this much to make it worth setting up this type of program and running it? Like, you're not going to do it if you have a $1 million bond that you're going to lend out.
Yeah. So the intermediaries are going to look for institutions that have a lot of assets. So they're going to be looking at, billions of dollars. And what they'll do is they'll come in, they'll look at your portfolio in totality, and they'll share with you what they believe the counterparties would be interested in. Because there's certain securities that the borrowers just aren't going to want. They aren't going to want particular bonds or stocks because they don't fit the parameters of what their needs are. So they wouldn't be lendable. So it's got to be a pool of lendable securities, and typically it's got to be sizable. in order to make it operationally effective for the intermediary, size does matter and lendable securities matter.
As we wrap up this discussion about securities lending, what's the state of in favor, out of favor of securities lending today? Pre-financial crisis, before 2008, very popular, even though there's different risk parameters, fell very much out of favor. Where is it today, particularly pre-pandemic, post-pandemic? I think we can say that now. What's the overall status of the recent securities lending market?
Yeah, I think the sec lending program or market in general is still robust, and it's a needed function within the markets. So I don't see sec lending going away, especially post Great Recession. Pre-Great Recession, there was the factor I talked about earlier with regards to indemnification. Without that, what was happening from the lender's perspective is they had a hard time getting their bonds back. And in many cases, they lost them. They literally weren't able to recover the bonds. And so they suffered losses that were significant. And it shut down a lot of securities lending programs, which was a big problem for broker-dealers and hedge funds because they rely on those programs. When the intermediaries came together and said, hey, we got to change this, it came down to the indemnification, which really helped bring back the sec lending industry, for lack of a better term. I don't know if it's truly an industry, but it's a financial function that is needed, and brought it back. And COVID was definitely a blow from our perspective. We drew back on the program. Not everyone did that, but some folks did do that. But the programs that were in place, a lot of them kept going. They kept engaged in lending securities. So it didn't dry up completely, but it did slow down for a brief period, and I think it's bounced back.
So just a follow-up, you talked about losing the bonds, and so the organizations that were lending lost those particular bonds because they were pulled out of the process, but you would still maintain the company that may have lost those bonds that they lended still had collateral that they then owned. Is that proper?
They did. They had collateral that they owned, which unfortunately during that period lost value. And so the sale of the collateral, if it wasn't cash, they took a hit.
Right, especially if it's a bond and rates shift or whatever, fall out of favor. Yep. So it's still collateralized program, but that depends on the type of collateral you have, right?
Exactly.
In the situation. Well, Paul, any final words on security lending?
Anyone that is thinking or contemplating engaging in a securities lending program, make sure you do your homework. You need to look at the total program, what it's going to take to stand it up, work with your internal partners, legal, accounting, investment operations, other functions within the organization that a program would touch. You'll have to put together a good rationale, a pitch book, for lack of better terms, that describes what the program is and helps the senior management team understand what you're going to engage in. For our program, it had to go to the board. So the board had to approve it. And that may not be uncommon with many companies, that would be a requirement. So there is a little bit of legwork to get the program stood up. Just make sure you do your homework.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining me on today's Treasury Update podcast.
Thanks, Craig. Appreciate it.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.